like in social media companies, you'll talk to an executive inside a company like Meta, and you'll point out this big problem, like a huge problem that they have. And then they'll say, well, it's not feasible to stamp that out. There's always going to be that kind of thing. And to which I want to say, yeah, but you built this thing, solve that problem. Like this isn't the weather. This isn't happening in the jungle. Like this is happening on a platform you created. So shouldn't you be responsible for that?
Hello and welcome to Urgent Futures, the show that finds signal in the noise. I'm your host, Jesse Damiani. I'm a writer, curator, and professor who's on a continual quest to learn about reality and how it's evolving. Each week, I sit down with leading thinkers whose research, concepts, and questions clarify the chaos, from culture to the cosmos. My guest this week is Jacob Ward. Jacob Ward is a veteran journalist covering the intersection of technology, human behavior, and social change. He's currently reporter in residence at the Omidyar Network, writing about cutting-edge innovation and pioneering forms of restraint, and a strategic advisor on the deployment of AI for companies large and small. From 2018 to 2024, he was technology correspondent for NBC News, reporting for Nightly News, The Today Show, and MSNBC. He is the former editor-in-chief of Popular Science magazine and was Al Jazeera's science and technology correspondent from 2013 to 2018. Ward is a lecturer at the Stanford D School and was a 2018 to 2019 Berggruen Fellow at Stanford University's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, where he began writing The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back, which is out now from Hachette Book Group. The book explores how artificial intelligence and other decision-shaping technologies will amplify good and bad human instincts and predicted the AI psychosis in which society is currently mired. Ward has written for The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Wired, and many other publications. In addition to hosting documentaries for Nat Geo and Discovery, he's the host and co-writer of the landmark 4-hour PBS television series Hacking Your Mind, about human decision-making, behavioral economics, and political manipulation. His weekly podcast, The Rip Current, covers the big hidden forces at work in our lives, and he speaks to an audience of more than 250,000 viewers on TikTok, on podcast appearances, and on This Week in Tech, where he's a regular co-host. Where to begin with this conversation? First, I'll say it's an absolute pleasure to speak with polymaths. I try to do it as much as I can on the show, and Jake is an exemplar, able to dance across topics with depth and nuance. As such, you'll notice that we move from questions about the futures of AI in society to contemporary politics to that conversation between Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates. What I especially love is how his ongoing research into behavioral and cognitive science has informed his approach to AI, a topic that has become inescapable, and as such is often crowded with noise and takes that are aggressively mid at best. But Jake has been consistently early and right about this stuff, even calling the Trump election in the PBS docu-series Hacking Your Mind. Meanwhile, he published The Loop mere months before Midjourney and ChatGPT took off in 2022, effectively sketching the key threats that would make themselves undeniable over the following years. These are the early jump-off points in our conversation, but it swerves delightfully from there, and I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. So I'll get out of the way and let you enjoy this rich conversation with Jacob Ward. All right, I am joined today by Jacob Ward. Jake, thanks for being on Urgent Futures.
Jesse, it's really nice to be here. I really appreciate it.
So I found you through your really incisive vertical video work, and that led me down this rabbit hole of your practice. So I want to get to the topics you're covering in your contemporary, both vertical video work, but also, your podcast and all of your writing. But I actually want to rewind the clock a little bit.
Sure.
I want to start with Hacking Your Mind.
Mm-hmm.
So you wrote on your website that documentary series predicted the rise of Donald Trump. It obviously does a lot of other things, but I wanted to invite you to start there. What is that documentary, and how did it predict the rise of Donald Trump?
Oh, I'm thrilled to start there. Yeah, that was a really life-changing experience for me. So in what would that have been? 2014, 2013, I got a phone call from a producer who wanted to was making a documentary called Hacking Your Mind. And he was such a cool guy. He said to me, he's like, this is my life's work, really, this documentary. It's going to be about how human beings make decisions and why we are so vulnerable to influence and manipulation. And you and I, if we did this together, would be spending a huge amount of time together over several years. And so I really want to make sure that we sort of know each other. And I knew by that point, you probably know, you spent time in LA, right? When you typically get you do like a Zoom call with somebody, and they'll want to just see that your face is symmetrical and that you can put words together, right? But this guy was like, no, I want to spend time with you. And he was like, can I fly to Oakland, where I live, and hang out for a little while? And I was like, oh, I don't know, it's kind of weird, but okay. And he shows up, and I was in a phase of my life where I was like, I'm going to try and just be absolutely honest with people about who I am and what I'm into. So when he was like, I'd like to take a walk. Where should we go walk? And I was like, well, let's go to this cemetery. There's a cemetery here called Mountain View Cemetery. That's an incredibly beautiful place to me, but is also a very interesting litmus test for whether you're the kind of person who likes to hang out in a cemetery or not. And he was so into it, and we had such this huge connection that it was like a perfect way to get started, because it was all about we just connected over the whole idea of the frailty of the human body and the frailty of the human mind. Anyway, long story short, we wound up doing this documentary series that was a 4-hour PBS series, as I say, about how easily we are manipulated based on the ancient most circuitry that drives the bus for us most of the time. So what the show is basically trying to give the viewers is a crash course in the last 50 years of behavioral science, which has essentially shown that we have inherited a very primitive but very effective, actually it's a very sophisticated, but it's a very ancient decision-making system that drives everything we do based on instinct. And that system, that people like Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, he's quite known for that, and a whole constellation of researchers that came out of his work in the 70s with a guy named Amos Tversky, that world has sort of shown us that we are super predictable in how we make choices. And one of the reason that we in the end wound up sort of predicting the rise of Donald Trump is that we were at the time making a show on the supposition that Hillary Clinton was going to win, right? Because that was everybody's assumption at that time, except for I don't think even the Trump people understood that they were going to win. So we thought that this was going to be a kind of postscript to sort of say, wow, look at what almost could have happened if we hadn't gotten on top of the manipulations of our ancient circuitry. Instead, right, we wound up filming right through his election in 2016. And the show basically just shows again and again that if you focus, we like to think that if we focus on our highest principles, on our ideas about ethics, morality, and our desire to bring people together and be inclusive, and our interest in giving people we will never meet a better life and a shot at justice and everything else, right? All these ideals we have for ourselves as modern humans. It turns out none of that shit works in politics. And what really works is saying, people who are not like us are bad, and I'm going to reclaim power from them for you. And that was, of course, Trump's message. And I don't think he understood. I don't think he was reading the same peer-reviewed journals we were. But I think that, as a researcher that I came to really enjoy put it, these guys just throw spaghetti at the wall, and that is the stickiest spaghetti. And so that show, we thought, was going to be this way of kind of thinking about what might have happened if things went wrong. And instead, we watched things go wrong, and we could explain very specifically why in that documentary. Now, that documentary, I should say, your listeners will be like, well, I've never heard of that documentary. You know why? It's because it came out on the exact same day as The Social Dilemma, which we didn't know, the documentary on Netflix all about social media and manipulation. And we just got buried. We got buried. We were sort of a modest PBS production, and so we didn't market it very well. This was kind of pre, the TikTok revolution. I wasn't yet doing vertical video, so we just didn't get it out there. But man, I look back at that now and I just go, oh, wow, we not to say that like we not to boast that we were right, but we were right in a way that we didn't even really realize we were going to be right. And so a really life-changing experience for me, Jesse.
Well, it always sucks when you're right about your either worst prediction or most fatalistic fears, which is a very natural segue. Actually, again, doing research, I saw that you published The Loop in early 2022, which
Right,
I found
right.
to be a real credit to your insight. But I also wonder if you were like, ugh, like
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
was like
yeah,
Midjourney, Dolly 2, and ChatGPT in the months to follow.
totally.
Yeah. So how when you look back at that book, I'm assuming you feel a mixture of things. What for? I guess let's start
Yeah,
at the start. What is that book? And then
sure.
how do you feel about that book looking back on it now?
So coming out of making Hacking Your Mind, I suddenly had all of this research and reporting and all of these contacts in the world of behavioral science. And I, at the same time, in my day job as a technology correspondent, I'd been a technology correspondent for Al Jazeera and then for NBC News. I realized that I was seeing all of these companies who were already coming out of the social media era trying to figure out, the whole business of the attention economy is predicting people's desires, getting out in front of them wherever you can, and and even shaping people's desires if at all possible. And so coming out of Hacking Your Mind, I was like, wow, we are really shapeable. And there's all of this nascent, at the time, but this was pre-transformer models. I was looking at like neural networks and machine learning, these sort of primitive AI models. And then suddenly transformer models hit, which are what gave rise to ChatGPT and the rest. And they suddenly made it possible for them to, for people to read huge amounts of human behavior data and get insight out of it. And I just thought, oh no, there's something terrible coming. And I need to, I'm not typically the kind of person who thinks like, I have to tell the world a thing or they won't know. But this was a thing where I just didn't see anybody say, I saw lots of books about super intelligence and the Terminator threat of AI and that kind of thing. And I wasn't worried about that. And I still remain pretty unconvinced that that's what's coming. What I was worried about was people are going to be suckered by this and they're going to treat it as way more sophisticated than it is. And that's going to get humanity into a lot of trouble if we're not careful. And so, so I wrote this book, The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. But it was so early in the sort of public awareness of AI that we didn't even put the word AI on the hardcover edition. It's The Loop, How Technology is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. Because we thought people would be like, what are you talking about, nerd? And so it wasn't until then ChatGPT came out that we were like, oh my God, we got to put out a paperback and change it to How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back, because that was AI is what the book is about. So yes, like you say, so I thought I was like 5 years early. I thought I was way out in front of this. And at the time that I was talking to people about it, they all sort of, some people were very interested. But when I was doing that book tour, people weren't really paying attention to AI as a thing yet. Certain categories of people were, but the general public certainly was not. And so, that the book came out, right as we're still dealing with the aftermath of COVID, and it just was a tough time to be promoting a book anyway. And then ChatGPT comes out sort of after all of the promotional effort has faded, and suddenly the market is flooded with AI books. And so I get all these emails now from people who say, man, I just read your book and I'm really blown away by it. I thought you were just sort of another one of the millions of AI books that were out there. And so in theory, the abstract satisfaction is to be right and be early. But it is really hard to watch your thesis come to life. The darkest version of your thesis come to life. My whole thing was, we are going to amplify the worst parts of humanity if we let the market run wild with this thing. And man, we're letting the market run wild. And but I have also, so you and I are speaking in part because, I kind of went dark for about a year, in which I just didn't want to even think about it. Once ChatGPT came out and I started to see the wheel spin, I just was so bummed by that I kind of stepped back from it. And I became allergic kind of to my own work in a way. And it's only just now that I'm looking around and thinking, wow, history is littered, I'm sure, with people who just sort of said, well, there's no point to it, uh, there's no point to, I was right, but nobody seems to care. And now I'm sort of going back and thinking, oh, that's not how we should be thinking about this. Like, I'll probably never be right again in my life. And this is a really important thing that we should be thinking about much more thoroughly than we have been. And so whatever help I can lend in that, I'm deciding I need to. So that's part of why you and I are having this conversation today.
Well, that's great to hear, because I basically want to spend the rest of the conversation inviting your ideas about how we make it through. Because of course,
Okay, all right,
we can't solve
great.
these problems.
Let's figure it out. We got an hour. We can
Two white
do it.
guys.
Yeah, we can do it. Two white guys can figure this out in an hour. That's right.
So what I so appreciate about the vertical videos, how I first encountered you, that I unfortunately have to thank algorithms for, is this way that you bring your decades of journalistic experience to bear in clear communication. You bring your more recent sort of journalistic expertise in behavioral science and human psychology, and you apply it to these topics that are really buzzy and elusive to people, like AI and the rise of fascism, particularly in America, but this kind of like global rightward slant.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that as a way of saying that's kind of the frame that I think we're going to be playing in for the rest of the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, sure.
You mentioned just now that you went dark for a year. I think the best place to start is like, what were you feeling inside that like dark year? Like before you came to the point of feeling like I got to step up and do this, because I think a lot of people are feeling that feeling. I mean, I can attest to feeling that feeling of like, God, it feels hopeless. It feels like screaming into the void.
Right.
It feels like everything you do is like one tiny drop inside of a giant ocean. So what were you feeling in that moment of darkness?
Well, I appreciate this. So, I mean, I should level set a little bit here by saying that I, until last year, was the technology correspondent for NBC News, which was for me a tremendously satisfying job. I was speaking to, America and the world about these topics on a daily basis, and that was a hugely satisfying thing. I'm a big believer in the institution of journalism. I know it comes under a huge amount of fire these days, but I really believe it is an important thing. Because let me tell you, people, when we don't have it, you're not going to like that. You may have some complaints about mainstream media now, but you wait till there's no media. Let's see how you feel then. So I really loved that job, but I lost that job. That industry is going through a huge amount of difficulty right now, as and this is not speaking specifically about NBC, but just in general, the industry, depended for years on click-throughs from Google search results or from social media to drive traffic to the website. It depended on people, watching television. And the combination of, the de-emphasis of news in social media and the incredible competition that social media represents, just from an attention economy perspective, and now this arrival of AI, which is going to kill off clicks entirely. Who's going to click through to a news article when AI can just summarize it for you, is creating a huge business challenge to the industry. And so I and a number of other people lost my job last year, right? Was laid off from there. And so that was part of it. And part of why I went, I mean, it was a big part of it. So part of why I went dark is that I had a certain amount of severance. I could spend that time suddenly with my kids, who I had not been able to be with for so many years because of all the crazy travel that my job involved. And I just was bummed. I just was depressed about the state of journalism and the ways in which I was watching AI come along in this form that where I could just sense that people were only too happy to let AI do what I consider to be like 80% of what's important about something like journalism. Summarize this for me and tell me what I should think about this. Is the kind of thing that AI is great at pretending, these large language models are great at pretending they can do. And people just seem to be too happy to let that happen. And so I think that was the darkness of it. But I also think that I was, I think I was selfish about it, basically. I think I just thought, this is the enormous privilege of my status in society, right? Is that I think I just sort of thought, well, if I'm right about this thing as thoroughly as I think I was, there should be some reward on the far end of that. I should be headlining conferences and, building a nonprofit around my work and blah, blah, blah. Like I just sort of had these grandiose notions of what was supposed to come my way. When in fact, like, before we came on camera, we were talking a little bit about Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent conversation, which I think is such a fascinating thing and was so helpful to me recently, because Ezra Klein in that conversation basically says something similar to mine, which is like, but if I'm a political persuader and I'm not able to persuade people, then what's the point of doing the work, is kind of his, what I took from his position. And Ta-Nehisi Coates was basically like, he says like, welcome to being black. He's like, it is not, you don't get the reward for holding on to your values. You just have to hold on to your values. You don't do it because they're politically expedient. You don't do it because they're popular. You do it because they're right. They're something you hold to be true. And that was very refreshing. That was a slap in the face that I needed, I would say, this week. And so I think I was already kind of coming out of it a little bit. I was starting to reach out to podcasts and saying, hey, I wrote this book that predicted this moment that we're in, and I think I'd like to sort of revisit it. Would you like to talk about that with me? And several people, including you, have come to me about that. It's been fantastic. And I think this conversation most recently has just had me saying, oh, this is not going to go the way I want it to, maybe even in my lifetime. But I still need to keep articulating what I've seen in the decade plus that I put into this book and into this beat. And so that's I think that's the darkness and how I've at least started to try to emerge from it.
Mm. Well, I want to, so because you brought up that interview, I want to spend some time on it, and then we can kind of get back to the more contemporary work that you've been doing since emerging from that darkness. Mm-hmm. There's been, I've been sort of batting around the idea of like, my response, my think piece take on it. And I've been finding myself like kind of unable to do that just because there's so many out there. And sure. I think there's like an endless amount of things to talk about there, because you have somebody, this is my estimation, I'm not putting this on you. You have somebody who, like politicians, has like ascended so thoroughly into abstraction that they've like lost the plot that these are things that happen in the world. And so you had this kind of this like 2-week period where I think any willingness among actual leftists to entertain him as a centrist character evaporated. You had the Charlie Kirk, his like Charlie Kirk eulogy. I don't know exactly what he would call it, but
right, in which he praises Charlie Kirk for doing politics right.
Right, doing politics the right way. Yeah, exactly.
That's right.
He has Ben Shapiro on the show to talk about de-escalation. Mm-hmm. And then he has that follow. I mean, and Ta-Nehisi Coates says this in the interview, that it is good of him and brave of him to have him on the show after such what is a very civil but scathing critique of his Charlie Kirk eulogy. But that conversation was infuriating to listen to me. So let's start there. Like, what was
I'd like to hear your take on it.
Well, say that again.
Well, so I'm interested by your take on it, because, okay, so I'll give you my 30 seconds and
Perfect.
you give me your 30 seconds. So my 30 seconds is, this is someone who, so Ezra Klein in this conversation basically he says two things that bothered me, but I also can relate to, because I think it's actually, I want people to be public with unattractive ideas wherever they can, so that they can actually be hashed out. And so in his case, he basically says two things that I thought were unattractive, but I'm glad he said them. The first one we've already mentioned, which is this thing of, I'm not having the effect that I thought I was going to have. He keeps saying, we did not, we have lost the popular vote this past time. We've lost the electoral college. Like, we've lost the sort of the body politic because we're not making our case properly. And so he ruminates, should we be shifting toward more friendly ways of putting our ideas? Should we be, electing people that run on more conservative ideas, but they'll secretly enact things that we want? Like, he's sort of speculating about whether or not we need to kind of like, he's talking about, people, his listeners and people who agree with him politically. Should we disguise our plans so they're more palatable to people? And so that's one thing. And I knew something was wrong with it, but I had to talk to many, many people over the course of that week to work it out. And my wife, among many people, had a big reaction to it. And one thing she pointed out was somebody she had been talking to who's a sort of systems change person. And she was saying one of the reasons that you hold the line on your ideas is so that the center won't drift away from you. If you let it drift, then the whole conversation moves in a direction where you don't get to be back where you were. You'll lose the center. And I thought that was really interesting and smart. You hold the center. So that was one idea. The other thing that he talks about, and this really bothered me, I'm not as understanding about this one, is he says a thing that actually Ben Shapiro sort of said on his show, which was, he basically says that Ta-Nehisi Coates' perspective seems fatalistic because it's so focused on the past. And because it's so that if you take the whole history of the United States as your context, then that creates a kind of fatalism and he says at one point, I prefer to think about the last 8 to 12 years. And that is very much what Ben Shapiro said on his show, which is basically we shouldn't be teaching kids this sort of sad history. We should be focused on the present and the future. And I just think that is such a convenient way to dodge the really important work of recognizing the history of oppression and racism and slavery and everything else that made the United States possible. So my dad is a historian of slavery and was a kind of woke person before that term was even a thing. He was writing these books in the 90s. And he'll tell you, flat out that, like, first of all, we haven't had an America without slavery for as long as we had America with slavery. We're not even in that phase yet. So the idea that we're somehow beyond it is crazy. Many other scholars have also pointed to the incredible economic power of slavery that made the United States possible. The reason that we get to be one of the most prosperous countries in the world is because we had free labor from so many people for so long. So the idea that you're somehow going to look away from that to make plans in modern America is crazy to me. And from my perspective, it really was helpful to look at that and say, oh, I need to look, and this is sort of what I try and do in the book, is like, I need to look beyond the last few financial quarters to think about how we're going to deal with AI and how technology is going to, mutate human society. We need to look at the history of technology mutating human society, which we can do. We can look way, 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 way back and find all kinds of useful and interesting things. So my reaction to this was very much like, I'm glad this conversation is happening in public. It didn't seem performative to me. It seemed like a genuine exchange of ideas, and I really want that. First and foremost, I really want that. And then I will also say, I really thought that those two aspects bothered me and helped me a great deal in thinking about how I want to be. So tell me yours. I want to hear your take on it.
Well, just to say, I love that, and you hit on two of my biggest critiques that I would say, and there's a lot of other backstory threading this. Like, for example, I think the book Abundance is like a toxic pile of trash that infects anybody.
It's a bummer, that book. I agree with you.
So
now I will say, as someone who lives in California, right? So for anybody who doesn't know, right, Abundance takes as its center, it's like, the red tape, that we need to cut away the red tape in society, essentially, and housing is one of the big centerpieces of that. And I will say, as a Californian, and you as a former Californian know, right, housing is one of the huge problems in this state. Like, it is, we need tons more housing, and we need it to move a lot faster in getting built. But I do think we're in this weird political moment where when people make a certain case and people who are, and conservative, in this case, conservatives jump on that and are excited about that, I think that tells you something about that argument. That's a bummer.
Yeah, and related to that, I saw somebody do this analysis where a lot of the statutes that they're even referencing were compromise statutes that Democrats implemented to get Republican basically rubber stamps to push that legislation through. Like you, housing in California is a massive problem. And so, yeah, we need lots of ideas thrown out. But the ideas that give more license for what is already a scary creep of authoritarianism to point and say, look, even your own team is calling you, that you're the friction. It's this extreme form of gaslighting. So I should say that was my bias going into that conversation.
Sure,
that is
right.
among my biases going into that conversation.
Yeah, right.
The only other thing I would add that really upset me about that conversation is, for all the aforementioned frustrations with him, he is a superb interviewer. I've literally studied his tapes. There are a few different interviewers who, I mean, and you host a podcast, like interviewing is hard. And it's not hard in a like, sure, you can craft out a bunch of questions and sort of just throw the questions, but it's like, how do you remain alert in the conversation?
Yeah.
How have you done enough research to where you're not having to kind of like look at your notes a lot? And like, how do you make it feel like a conversation? And I feel like historically, and maybe this is in part because he didn't go on video until a few months ago, and maybe there was editing in the audio to sort of like give more of this impression, but I felt like, wow, his agility is really impressive, and the research that he's clearly doing, and the fact that he really cares, all of that comes through in these like really tight interviews. And so that interview felt aberrant to me in the sense that it didn't feel like he was listening very well. It felt like he was like waiting for particular buzzwords to kind of like implicitly continue to argue his point. But like there's this moment where Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and Ezra Klein's response is like, yeah, bad things happen. Where it's like, no, there's a deeper point being made here about structural inequalities in America. So yeah, we don't have to belabor this because I don't want to spend all our time talking about this, but I just felt like that series of events, also the proposal to run an anti-choice candidate as a Democrat, like all of those things kind of all in tandem just really discouraged me. But anyway, moving from Ezra Klein, you wrote this book.
Can I pivot to something that I think we want to talk about today?
Please.
Based on that I think that what you're saying reminds me of is, so I think it is so much easier to basically to capitulate. It's so much easier to say, let's, like I can't tell you how often people, when I talk about AI and my concerns about it and some regulatory suggestions over them, one thing that people like to say a lot is, well, AI is here to stay. The toothpaste is out of the tube, and that sentiment of like, well, we just have to take as a given that this thing has to exist is, to me, like that's a really problematic position to start from. And I can't tell you how often I'm in a position where, like in social media companies, you'll talk to an executive inside a company like Meta, and they'll say, and you'll point out this big problem, like a huge problem that they have. And then they'll say, well, it's not feasible to stamp that out. There's always going to be that kind of thing. And to which I want to say, yeah, but you built this thing, solve that problem. Like this isn't the weather. This isn't happening in the jungle. Like this is happening on a platform you created. So shouldn't you be responsible for that? And I think it's easy to sort of say like, well, this is the way of the world now, and so we don't, because it's so much harder to stay disciplined in the face of big systemic changes that we really don't like and really don't want. And so I don't know, what you're saying reminds me of that, the instinct to sort of say toothpaste is out of the tube, rather than saying, hey, you know what? We put the toothpaste into the tube. Like, we're pretty good at tubes in this country. Like we can kind of put toothpaste wherever we want it, really. Like, aren't we good at that? So that's how I end up feeling about that.
I love that. Well, and it relates broadly. Like, there's like, it's kind of like a Matryoshka doll sort of situation where it's like, to me, one of the outer layers of that Matryoshka doll is progress, where it's like, well, progress has got to happen. And it's like,
right.
Sure, if you think so, but progress for whom and toward what? And like there's so many sort of particulars inside of that just get sort of swept away.
Yes.
And to your point, It's not the weather. These are things we're creating.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I sat with a group of people I had the good fortune to be part of a fellowship it was a behavioral science fellowship. Anyway, it got invited into various academic circles that were really interesting. And one of them was
Stanford, right?
Yeah, at Stanford. And one of the gatherings I got to go to was a whole thing about sort of like reimagining, basically reimagining the politics of growth was the idea, because what they were basically saying is that like the vision for America has always been growth at any cost is good, and how can we sort of rethink that? And that was many years ago. That was 2018, I think, that I was in that conversation. And now I have this book concept that I'm putting together, and the tentative title of it is "Great Ideas We Should Not Pursue." Because it is, I think we're absolutely at this moment that you were describing, Jesse, which is like, wait a minute, why are we building this thing exactly? Like, what problem does this solve? Like, I just think to myself, like, haven't we made enough money? Like, isn't there enough of that going around at this point? It's not well distributed, but there's certainly enough,
And we created that too.
And we created that too. So like, shouldn't we be trying to get to a point now where we think about building things on a basis other than market fit and innovate, the potential for innovation? Like, what is and people will say, well, what is the purpose of living and working, and what's going to be our motivation in this world if it's not to just sort of build things? People often say, like, I'm a builder, I like to build. And I'm with that. I like to build things too, but I think we do have to think a little bit beyond the traditional rewards of it and think like, what are we building and why exactly? Because we are definitely in that moment where like I'd be curious for your take on, have you played around at all with the new Sora? So Sora is...
I'm so glad you brought it up. But
Let's go.
I haven't, but I'll explain why later.
Okay. So ChatGPT maker, OpenAI, for anybody who doesn't know, has this system Sora, which is it's like Midjourney. It's a text to video and text to image creator. And now they've given you the ability to make 10-second vertical videos of anything you want. And it's gonna basically like be that. And already my TikTok is full of these. Here's Martin Luther King as a DJ. Here's the Jesus and the disciples doing a restaurant review. And they're funny, and there's some funniness to them. But holy shit, like what problem are we solving? And what about what's going to, what's going to happen when we can't believe video evidence anymore? It's really freaking me out. I'm curious what your reaction has been to this.
You took the words out of my mouth. I guess I'm actually working on a piece about this that I will publish. So I've been covering disinformation and deepfakes since 2018, off and on. Mm-hmm. And my fear that I outlined in that earlier coverage was like, actually, the high level stuff is really never what we need to worry about per se. Yes, it's a problem. Like, there will definitely be sort of AI slop of politicians saying things they didn't say, but then that will get debunked pretty quickly. And people will just have a little egg on their face, and it's kind of like game over. But the whole thing about politicians is they're highly public. So if there's nobody there to assert that they said what they said in that false video, then that's a temporary problem. Mm-hmm. But there's this whole other dimension that I think is a much vaster problem, which is what you're getting at, which is A, just the sheer deluge of noise, but B, the existence of synthetic video this plausible is that now bad actors are like, yes.
Oh, man.
And one thing that I've put in this report, which will be out by the time this episode comes out, it's literary how concurrent Sora 2 coming out is with the ongoing delay of the Epstein files. Because you get to a point where 2-3 months down the line and say the Epstein files finally do get released, all of a sudden they have this thing to point to and say like, oh no, this is just the radical left FBI, Biden's FBI, look, there's these incredibly capable video generators. And so all this evidence you're looking at is fake. And that as a microcosmic example of what I think is going to be a vast phenomenon. And then, to your point around like how we relate to history, like I do think it's fun and playful to remix. And so I'm not trying to like shit on that impulse.
The early internet, right, was the great lesson of it was we should let people remix whatever they can. It's super cool and amazing and makes cool things. That's right.
Totally. So it's like I don't want to poo-poo that. But to your earlier point, it's like I'm not entirely sure what problem this solves, but I'm very sure about all the problems it creates.
Yeah, exactly. So I had a conversation with Lawrence Lessig, who's a big IP attorney, and he was on an episode of the Rip Current of my podcast, and he was the original like young internet savvy lawyer who in the 90s was saying, the hell with IP law. We should basically throw away intellectual property and allow people to remix endlessly. And he was one of the people who created the Wikimedia idea that like you could have this sort of free media floating around for people to use. Very cool. So I just interviewed him about, I don't know, a year ago now, less than that, 6 months ago. And I was like, so how are you feeling now? And he was like, totally different. I feel the opposite, essentially. He was like, I don't feel that way anymore. And so I had this, I got to go on this trip to Lisbon, to Portugal for the first time last year with my mom. And we wandered into this museum that I didn't know anything about called Aljube in Lisbon. It was a former political prison. It was where you would be put if you were a dissident. And it was in there, standing in that place, that I learned for the very first time for me about the history of fascist oppression in Portugal, which I didn't know anything about. So it turns out that when Francisco Franco was doing his horrible thing in Spain, right next door, this guy Salazar was doing the same thing in Portugal. And he ruled that place for 50 years. It's like a young, imagine a 20-something fascist comes along instead of the 70-something we've got now. And he has a 50-year run of controlling that place. And they were talking at the end of the exhibit about how it all sort of came apart. And basically what it was is that they held on to their colonial holdings for too long, their holdings in Africa and elsewhere. Excuse me. And that sort of overstretched their resources, and they ran out of money in it. And that's part of why it all fell apart. But I was thinking at that time, I was looking at this display of all of these dissident groups trying to get the United States to pay attention, trying to get the international community to pay attention, trying to get coordinated amongst themselves. And I was thinking to myself, if they had what we have now in terms of communication, would that have made their fight to get organized and overthrow this fascist regime, would that have made that easier or harder? And I came to this place where I was like, that back then where you were doing everything by mail, they didn't, and at the time, if you had an unregistered typewriter in Portugal, you could be put in prison for the rest of your life and tortured to death. So clearly that's a worse option. I think about today though, where you could have people creating deep fakes of each other, of the dissidents, and everyone's super distracted anyway, and not exactly able to pay attention to a really big humanitarian difficulty, like we've seen with Gaza, for instance, right? People are not exactly rising up. There are some people who are, but it's not like everybody is. And I just think, man, I'm not sure. I feel like this is such a noisy, deceitful moment. I'm not sure that we would be that much better now. And then I think about that middle period in the internet's history where Lawrence Lessig was first operating in the 90s. And I'm like, that's the period where, that's the period that made it possible for like the Arab Spring to happen, right? On early Facebook. But now everything is so confused and about to get so much more confusing. I just feel like the original promise of the internet of like connecting people and letting you see things clearly and all that stuff has been perverted in this really fundamental way.
Absolutely. Wow. That's like a mic drop answer.
I got to go. Well, thanks everybody. You'd be great.
That's all for now, folks. So you're moving us in the direction that I'm really excited that we're going, which is, again, the sort of interconnection of AI, behavioral science, and the sort of rightward slant of lots of places, but particularly America. Yeah. I think in order to get to the rightward slant thing, I'd love to spend a little time kind of zooming all the way out and doing some of the bullet point take format of what the 2025 AI landscape is. So really thinking through what are the risks that are most alarming to you? What are the ways that people should be thinking about AI? Like, what's the AI landscape? And then you can kind of see how we point that. Yeah.
So here's how I think about the landscape that we're in right now. So first of all, my top headline is power. So up until now, great inventions that led to huge public communications infrastructure, like the internet, for instance, came out of government and academic research, right? Those were publicly funded programs. This is now, I would argue, a more transformative, and I don't mean this in an admiring sense, I mean this in a dangerous sense. I think this is going to be a more transformative moment, potentially more transformative moment, and it is entirely in the grip of basically 7 big companies. And those companies are hiring the smartest researchers out of academia, giving them titles like research scientist. That's like one of the hottest LinkedIn job titles out there. and letting them come to these corporate campuses, right? Everything is named as if it's a university, and letting them, and co-opting basically this incredible public talent into this private effort to create these foundational models. So the big foundational models, right? So this is those made by companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, Facebook or Meta, Perplexity, Anthropic. These companies are the only ones with the resources it takes to build these big foundational models because they cost incredible amounts of money. And so it's just, for me, I'm just like, this truly is like, this is a very powerful cartel that oversees the industry, essentially. And some people are building their own little models here and there, but for the most part, those guys run the show. And so that's one big headline. There's a huge amount of power at the top of that. That then gives rise to all kinds of, so for me, there's many, many concerns with that, but one of them is political. So the nature of being the head of a huge company like that is that you are by your nature a very transactional person. You're not typically in that role because you have very firmly held principles that you're willing to, that you would compromise a company's future for. You're not that kind of person. You are someone who, one way I've always described it is like, tech CEOs never do anything for one reason. They always do things because they serve multiple purposes. So these are very flexible thinkers, very transactional, flexible thinkers. And so it's no surprise to me that they all go to, for instance, this big, praising dinner of Trump, this banquet for Trump, last month, or that Tim Cook at Apple, presents Trump with a big gold, prize to win favor with him, because these guys they're not about fighting back. They're about capitulating in the name of their shareholders. And so there's that. There's the power that these guys have, and then there is the, once upon a time I had people would always say to me, well, you can trust, we don't need regulation. You can trust the moral compass of these companies because they are so enlightened. And once upon a time that was true because it had to be, because that was how you recruited young people to work for you, was you had to show that you were very moral. I don't think that's as true anymore. And we're seeing now that the political expedience of, being willing to work with Trump on some pretty spooky stuff is now part and parcel with being the head of one of these companies. So there's that. Then there is the financial worry I have. So the capital expenditures, the investment in stuff that these companies have made, in building data centers, because you have to build these huge, just mountains and mountains of servers to process. Every time you ask for a 3-breasted woman, out of Sora or whatever, you are crunching through a huge amount of data and a huge amount of power and water for cooling. And so the mountains of what they call compute that you have to put together to make that possible are hugely expensive. And so these companies, those capital expenditures accounted for 1/3 of the growth in GDP between last year and this year, right? The total economy is like, it's in the, I'd have to look this up, but it's like, tens of trillions, but it's, there's a number, right? And NVIDIA is like, which makes the chips for these companies is like 4 trillion right now, so, and NVIDIA has begun sinking investment money back into OpenAI, who is one of their number one customers. So you suddenly have this kind of human centipede situation in which people are beginning to invest in one another in a way that is very incestuous and weird. Plus, there's all kinds of sort of derivative financing kind of stuff that smacks to me of the mortgage crisis. So, if we're going to put so much of our if so much of our GDP is going to depend on these companies, and even 1/3 of the value of a company like NVIDIA goes away, that's going to have an incredibly destructive effect across the economy. And so, as I see them engage in these weird financing shenanigans, I get more and more nervous about that. So those are those are the bullet points of just like, That's the one where, like, if aliens landed on the planet and I needed to explain the structural problem that we're facing, that's the stuff that I would just be like, here's the easy thing you can see. And then below that, you get into the squishy stuff, which is my layer, which is, you know, I think people are very, very eager to hand off difficult work wherever they possibly can. It is not our fault. It is in our programming. I have a whole book about it. You can read if you want to. That we are built to outsource our decision making. It's how we've come this far. And nothing is more tempting than a fancy looking machine that offers to make your choices for you. We love that kind of machine. We have throughout history. And so in my mind, this is the ultimate hack for your mind, this system that promises to make your choices for you. And that is why you are seeing company after company scrambling to fire humans wherever they can and give these machines the ability to decide who gets a job and who gets a loan and who gets bail, who's going to date one another. We're just so eager to hand off to these things. And so that's the squishy layer below the big structural and political and economic problems that I think these systems are going to create. That squishy layer for me is where I spend. That's my 3 a.m. layer. That's where I wake up and gnash my teeth.
Well, let's spend a little more time there then.
Yeah.
Maybe one way in, you did a piece recently that was, I'm getting the title slightly wrong, I think, but it was like what
Sure.
GPT-5 really means. That I think kind of connects into this squishy layer you're describing.
So GPT-5, when they rolled it out, they did this big, in the tech reporting world that I've been in, you spend hours and hours and hours negotiating access to these product debut moments. These Apple, one more thing, iPhone debuts kind of things. And the dog and pony shows that they do are very, like, the choreography of them are just something I've spent a huge amount of, like an embarrassing amount of my career on. And so the GPT-5 rollout was so amazing because it obeyed all of that same stuff. Like, oh, thanks, Sam. Now I'm going to tell you guys about, it was that format, but for a thing where, for instance, they at one point they bring up I think it was an employee of OpenAI and his wife who is stricken with cancer. And they have her describe just how useful GPT has been for her in navigating her journey through cancer. And I just was like, whoa, like this is a system that doesn't, it doesn't understand words. All it does is parrot them extremely well. Like they love to talk about it as a reasoning model, and that it is learning over time. And, as any technical person can explain to you, that is not how this system works. What it does is it knows based on what's been said already, how statistically likely the following combination of words are to come next. So it's how I play the piano. Like, I don't know anything about music theory. I can just I've learned a thing and I can do that one thing. I don't play the piano. I just am a mimic, and to see that deployed for this as a sort of cancer doula was like, oh my Lord, and then it sort of dawned on me over the course of that thing that what they're also trying to do is, as we were just talking about, there's this incredible amount of money being invested in this stuff. And the shareholders in these companies, the investors in these companies are going to want that money back at some point, which is why this alarm has been raised by Wall Street analysts over and over again. Like, when are we getting our money back exactly on this, incredible investment? So it's just clear to me that the pressure on these companies is building and building and building to make a product and make money back. And that's why you have them talking about advertising. It's why you have them, talking about using this stuff to navigate your medical diagnosis. They're trying to create a case for a product for this as much as possible. And for me, just the reminder that this is not the early days of the internet when graduate students were using, the earliest, who is finders to track each other down and email each other at another campus. That is not what this is. This is now a world in which people have made an incredible investment in this, made huge promises, and owe a lot of money. And that's going to, I think, lead to some really squirrely behavior that I'm really worried about. So that, for me, GPT-5, I think I was trying to make the point that, like, it just represents this turn toward, not just playing around with this stuff because it's fun to write wedding vows with it, but companies really trying to get it into your life wherever they possibly can to make money off you.
Totally. Well, and I love that you brought up the financial concern, because another, like you, I have like tons of kind of like drafts floating around. But another piece is some research I've done reading those Wall Street analysts, basically coming to the, like, again, I'm not an economist, conclusion that when the AI bubble pops, and by my estimation, built on people much smarter than me, it is a bubble. Mm-hmm. When it pops, it will be like, according to the current numbers, it would actually be much worse than the subprime mortgage collapse.
Right.
And so it's like, what's the runway there? Is it 6 months? Is it 18 months? Is it 36 months? And that matters when we look at the ways that inevitably the economy is wrapped up in the political decisions that are being made. And of course, disorienting moments financially end up being fertile ground for authoritarian takeover. And for
right. I mean, we've certainly seen that, right? That's the history, is like unemployed men are one of the great lonely unemployed men are one of the great destructive forces in history. And we're about to see a huge amount of that. I was just at a gathering in Washington, D.C. of people who were thinking about labor and AI, and one speaker, very smart, she was saying that her theory is that AI is going to be to high school educated women what the Industrial Revolution was to, or what what outsourcing and offshoring was to high school educated men. And she was making the point that she worries that, the good clerical and bookkeeping and admin jobs that you can get with a high school degree that can lead you into a real career, you can retire with, have a good middle class life and retire in that role, that's all the stuff that this stuff is designed to replace, or is being used to replace. And I think there is such, I think Andrew Yang, who ran on this idea of universal basic income, was, I think, a little, talk about a guy who must be frustrated that he was early and right? He is that guy. And he was early and he was right. That I think we are about to enter a world in which so many of the jobs that we took for granted as being a pathway forward are going to just disappear, not because they need to, but because these companies are pushing so hard to make their money back, and that ends up being why. One thing I quote over and over again, because I think it is so helpful, is Sam Altman, founder of OpenAI, told Alexis Ohanian in a January 2024 podcast interview that he's got a bet going with his tech CEO friends as to what financial quarter will see a one-person billion-dollar company. That's sort of and it just teaches you everything you need to know about the perspective. Is like that clearly he considers that good,
aspirational.
Aspirational. Whereas I look at that and I just think that's a nightmare, because that's, I don't care how rich you are, like, you're not employing enough gardeners to employ us all. Like, that's it. Any thought that we had that, trickle-down economics never really worked, but it's really not going to work when there's a handful of single-person billionaire companies. And so, I think the effect that could have on us in terms of becoming a fertile ground for authoritarianism, yes. Oh, brother. I mean, we're there already, right? Like, we're already in this place of incredible income inequality and frustration. And I think that's part of why we're in this authoritarian moment we're in. People like a strong man when they're feeling nervous about the future.
Carry on, say more.
Yeah, well, I mean, right, this is the history of it. So we were talking about Portugal a moment ago. Salazar was a finance minister, a sort of young buck finance minister. And at that time, there was a kind of liberal monarchy. I mean, it was literally like, it was what we would have in the early 20th century, what we now consider coastal elites, right, were in charge. Kind of, it was that sort of idea that these sort of like highly educated monarchs they had no answer for the big financial distress that Portugal was in. People were having a huge trouble, putting two and two together. There was just enormous hardship. And along comes this authoritarian figure, Salazar, and he's a finance minister at the time. He says, I will fix this problem. I will take the power back from the elites and give it to you and make your lives better. And that set the stage. And he, but very quickly he pivoted to, away from just, making the economy better. And he actually knew something about making the economy better. I should be clear. Like, that guy actually knew, he was a finance minister. He was educated in finance. He wasn't just a business guy. And so he did actually make some positive improvements, but very quickly, he also, made some very crazy, cultural changes. He was a big culture war guy. And pretty soon he was giving speeches about how women need to stay in the home and, degenerates should be imprisoned and, and before long, women were not allowed to hold the same jobs as men, and women couldn't be a lawyer or a judge. One of the things that I experience now when so Portugal is famous for its beautiful artisanal homewares. It's soaps and it's all the stuff that you would have in your pantry. That comes out of Portugal, the canned fish and all of that stuff is gorgeous. Like, the design of it is beautiful. But one of the reasons is you weren't allowed to make art that was cathartic or political. If you were an artist, a creative person, you had to put it into something that was acceptable by the government. And one of the things the government was really into was making it as attractive as possible for women to stay at home. And so for me, that just the ways in which you can so quickly metastasize from the kind of, economic uncertainty and the political expedience that creates to this world in which suddenly you have really enshrined some very scary rules that affect people for a generation. Now Portugal's on the other side of that, but I was talking to one woman and she said there's nobody more judgmental of women who don't work and don't have kids than my mother's and grandmother's generation. The women who lived through that time are more judgmental of us than anybody else, because they were so brainwashed by it and are so angry in a way they probably haven't even examined, And I was just thinking, man, if we were to fast forward a couple generations from now to a world in which people are still so distracted, maybe even more so than they ever were, and where we've developed a little bit of a taste for authoritarianism, what will that generation look like? I'm not convinced it's going to have like snapped back toward equality and, opportunity and the rest of it. I worry it might go somewhere else, and we don't know what that looks like.
Right. Especially, this isn't the conversation for this, but especially given the destruction of the biosphere, which provides ecosystem services that number actually, in their totality, vastly beyond global GDP. And so
that's right.
As soil desertifies, as the ocean goes anoxic, like as all these things are happening and everything you just described.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Oh, if you think about, so I've been thinking recently about India. So there's a really interesting study that came out of MIT Tech Review recently about caste bias in AI models in India. So in India, in Hinduism, there's a teaching, a belief that you can be reincarnated, and when you can either move up or down the social strata, and that's your caste. So at the top are the Brahmin, at the bottom are the Dalit, and there's been huge discrimination against people based on caste for many, many generations. It's now illegal to do that, and India has fought very bravely to try and do away with that kind of stuff. They hold open certain political seats for people from the Dalit caste. They really are trying to fight back against it. Well, it turns out that when you create a Western-built AI model like OpenAI, and you introduce it to India, and you ask it questions like, who's more qualified for a job, a Dalit or a Brahmin, it's always going to choose the Brahmin. Or you ask it to draw a picture of a Dalit, it'll sometimes draw a picture of a dog. It's full of bias, again, that country has been fighting forever to get rid of. And we're about to see that country, I think, decimated economically, because huge amounts of knowledge work, call centers and the outsourced design work and all of the stuff that goes through India, that stuff that AI is going to wipe out. You combine that with what you're describing, right? The climate emergency we're going to see. India already has cities that regularly see temperatures over 110 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures in which you cannot work. That's going to mean mass exodus, mass unemployment, mass exodus, and so, yeah, it's a real powder keg. There's some really scary stuff that can happen there. And and meanwhile, we just think we're like making a fun poetry writer, or making a fun thing have you seen this thing about where it'll, there's a sea shanty going around called How Do I Fly an F-16? It's an AI made song that gives you specific technical instructions on how to start an F-16. It's like a big hit, and I'm like, oh, that's funny, but do I want all of overcooked India to not have a job for that? I don't know. I don't know that I do.
Yeah. Oof. Well,
I know we can get so dark. May I make a proposal here?
Please.
Let's go for a couple of things that we think are good about.
Love it. You're going where I wanted to go because and I want to call this out for folks.
Yeah.
You in the subhead for the loop, you talk about how to fight back, and so that's what I wanted to get to. So yeah, let's take it away.
Okay. Well, so I'll give you a couple of things that I think are very, so basically the way I sort of think about it is like, there are a million very cool uses of AI that I think could be hugely improving for the world. And the headline I'll give you here is, you don't get to make money off any of them. That's the thing. Like, basically, there's a lot of really great money-losing uses of AI that are going to be hugely beneficial for us. Now, there are some money-making ones in the sort of foundational science sense. Like if you aim a transformer model at all the stars in the sky, it's going to discover something really, really amazing, right? It's going to be a huge help to astronomers. That is true also if you feed it, pictures of every cancerous mole that's ever been photographed in a hospital, right? There are some medical uses that I think can both be can make people some money and are going to do good in the world. And that's fine. I'm into those. Fantastic. But I also think, there's stuff like, I know a guy who is trying to build a model on the East Coast where unfilled state jobs are offered to newly arrived immigrants in that state, because you can match people's qualifications with just a little bit of data intake when someone arrives as an immigrant and describes their work experience. You can very quickly be like, oh, this person can be a bus driver, can be one of the school bus drivers that we have so much trouble hiring for. Huge matchmaking potential there that I think could be incredible. Another one is the ability to put people in need of social services with those services. So the dynamic right now is you got to go and apply for the services you need. What if instead you just fed the data through a system that said, oh, this person has had a domestic violence episode and has been unhoused, and you could then immediately say, well, here are the openings in this program, and just put that person together with it so that they don't have to go through the frickin' bureaucracy of it. I had this, the former president of Estonia, this guy Thomas Ilves, on, and he's fascinating because he built a whole system that makes that totally possible, where as opposed to the panopticon surveillance regime that Trump has been trying to push Palantir to build, you instead make a system of what he describes as little Christmas ornaments. Like there are these little balls hanging all over this tree. Here, one is your medical records, one is your police, history, here's your banking history, and none of them are accessible by any of the others, but you can access all of them. And we could absolutely build something like that, such that you could say, oh, based on your history, you would really benefit from freaking therapy, or whatever. Like we could match people with what they need using these systems, I think, in a way that could be really, really positive. So between that and for me, there's a huge amount of historical investigation that I would like to see. There's a guy I describe in my book named Donald Black, who has this incredible theory that he has managed to put together over like 50 years of work about how that law falls unfairly on people of different groups in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be surprised by. But he has identified the mechanism by which he thinks that gravity falls more harshly on some groups than on others. And he's managed to substantiate it with like just the work he's been able to do, like going through legal codes from around the world by himself. Give that guy a model. Give that guy an AI model to run with, and see what he comes up with. For me, I want all these tokens not to be handed over to like call center people. I want them to be handed over to like psychology PhDs. Go figure out some stuff and don't make money off it. That's the other thing. Don't then turn that into a super addictive feed. Turn it into something that we need. So I think that it has huge potential. It's just the money making that gets it's power. It's that top layer that gets us in trouble.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I will say I use AI sparingly, but when I do, specifically transformer models, but when I do, it's actually to make my life harder. That's not true. There are times I use it to make my life easier. Like the other day, I needed to snake my drain in the bathroom, and it was actually easier to find the resources I needed to understand how to do that using ChatGPT.
Sure. Fine.
But
it's like YouTube. Right.
Yeah, it's like YouTube, and it's sort of meta YouTube because it pulls in the YouTube video, it pulls in the sort of text description. But the thing that I most like to use it for is to make my life harder, which is I use it as a tool to teach me what else I need to research and learn, where it's kind of like I'll sketch what I've started researching and I'll be like, I need all the sources on, whatever this topic is. And then I'm treating every one of those sources as its own little kind of urchin that points in a bunch of different places. So it's kind of to provoke me into finding alternative sources than I'd find in the kind of linear Google scroll.
Yeah, I like that.
So
I like that.
Building on your,
and again, like that's, that is not what these, product announcement days are going to say. Like, you can make your life much more complicated. you can learn, you can find out everything you didn't know, and should spend time learning. They instead want to make it be like, you never have to think about it again. You never think about anything again. So my bummer is like, or my conviction is like, we're not gonna teach ourselves to be different than we are. So it's important to, but I really like the idea. Like my thing is, use it to go find the things you need, to go get the things you need. This is, I have 2 daughters, and what we always talk about with the internet is like, don't let it entertain you. Use it to go get what you need. And for my, like, that's the standard I bring to how I try to use AI. It's like, don't make me laugh. I got friends for that. Go find me, the top, moments on the last few Urgent Futures podcasts. You know what I mean? And let me know, how to best give Jesse what he wants. That kind of thing. Like you can use it, I think, as a research assistant in a way that I like, that I think would be good. But so the easy money making isn't about research. It's about, making you laugh, making you distracted. We are worth more in that form than we are, activated and educated.
100%. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to spend the last chunk of time. We got a little bit of time left. Just looking at like that fight back question. Like obviously we have, Larry Ellison's in the ring now. You've got all the concerns around TikTok, which I know that you've spoken and written about.
Man, I had such a good thing going on TikTok, and now it's going to go. Yeah, now it's going to go away. I guess nothing lasts. It's just how it goes. Yeah. Keep going.
Nothing gold can stay. But yeah, what looking at the landscape and that really beautiful and lucid breakdown of what the big problems are as well as the squishy problems. How do we fight back in this moment? What are some things people should be thinking about doing in their daily lives to push against this kind of techno-fascist, techno-authoritarian emerging reality?
Yeah. So I think that there is a what people can do in their own lives is always a tricky thing for me, because the way the system is built and the way the technology works makes it very difficult for individuals to do anything. And that's by design. There's a reason that you're not allowed to renegotiate the terms of service on your iPhone. You have to either accept it or not use the phone. And that takes away your democratic inputs. You're not allowed to have your typical democratic inputs. You can't go meet with Tim Cook and renegotiate, right? And so that, for me, when people talk about, what can a person do at home? I just want to point out, like, it's too much to say that it's on us to fight back, because that is, I think, not feasible. But I'll start with some basics in that realm that I think is good. So one is, I just think, like, you're what you described about how you use ChatGPT and other models, is really is something I want more people to do, and that is friction. I want people to introduce a little bit of friction into the process. So for me, that's things like, I am very susceptible to addictive behavior with my phone. And so I have to, like, brick it every so often. I use a thing called a brick that is literally a little, I have it right here. It's a little 3D printed RFID tag. I click my phone against it and it turns off all but the most basic functions on the phone until I come back and brick it again, unbrick it. And for me, I have to use that or I lose the whole day to scrolling TikTok or whatever else. And so I introduce little bits of friction in my life all the time for that. It reminds me a little bit of what I had a guy on the podcast named David J, whose specialty is fighting loneliness and how to make good friendships. And one piece of advice that he has is one of the good watchwords for him about, he talks about the difference between a good, like a real relationship and a transactional relationship. And I was like, well, what's the difference? And he's like, well, in a transactional relationship, you know exactly what you're going to get. You know just what the two of you are going to do. And this is what a lot of professional relationships are. He's like, whereas in a real friendship, it's a surprise. You don't know what you're going to get. And to my mind, our use of this stuff needs to sort of be based on that. I like that idea that, like, keep it so that you don't know what you're going to get. Don't fall into these habits that where you know just what the day is going to look like, based on scrolling TikTok forever or using ChatGPT to do all your work for you. Like, just what it'll be. So I don't know. I'm sort of thinking out loud with that one, but I'm playing with that one. The thing that I'm hitching most of my hopes to in how things change is the courts. Like, lawyers have a bad rep in this country, but I really put a huge amount of faith in, or hope anyway, in how the legal system could work, because a highly motivated litigator with a class action lawsuit can make huge differences in this country. That is why you and I, Jesse, are not smoking cigarettes right now as we have this conversation, right? The ability to sue the bejesus out of the cigarette manufacturers is a huge reason that we don't smoke in the numbers we used to. Lawsuits are part of how we got seatbelts in cars. It's why football players wear helmets. We are able in this country to make huge changes based on that. And right now, and we are already seeing litigators make an argument against big companies, not just on the basis of economic losses or death, which is typically the basis on which we've only ever won in the past, but on things like, you created a change in someone's brain. You shaped their behavior in a way that was not good. And even, they've been doing that for a long time in places like Europe, but even in the US, where we are typically pretty allergic to thinking of people as being manipulatable, we like to think that everybody's responsible for their own behavior all the time. We're seeing big companies do big settlements. There was a big settlement with a bunch of book authors recently, I think is going to cause another big foundational company to be like, maybe we're not going to just steal everybody's work in the future. I think the parents of this kid, Adam Rainey, who committed suicide after spending way too much time on ChatGPT, they're suing OpenAI, and if a class action comes out in a few years because a lot of kids are doing that, that could be a big change, So I really believe that the courts are potentially able to do what, as individuals, we don't have the power to do, and as a body politic, we don't have the political will to do. I think the ability to sue the bejesus out of somebody is really a still very powerful thing in this country, and I'm putting a lot of faith in that.
All right. Your lips to God's ears.
Yeah, we'll see.
I have 3 questions that I like to close every episode with. You can think of this as a lightning round, or you can give a little elaboration.
Yeah.
So the first one is, what's one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I really wish people paid more attention to how, basically, I want people to understand that these LLMs don't know you and don't know what you're saying. They are only mimicking, they have an incredible memory for statistics. And so when they hear the beep, boop, beep of your words come in, they know that that beep, boop, beep corresponds to these beep, boop, beeps, and they give those back. But they don't know what beep, boop, beep means. They don't know that. And so the illusion that this thing knows you and is in some way learning you is an illusion. That's not what it does. So before you take cancer advice or hand these over to your kids, you should know that. So I wish people understood more what AI is not. That's my big one.
Love that. What is one resource you recommend for making better sense of reality?
Well, I would. So I've talked about my own book, The Loop, here, but one book that really is, I think, powerful and important and kind of points at the next thing that everyone is going to need to start thinking about is a book by a Duke law professor named Nida Farahani called The Battle for Your Brain, in which she describes how some of the same companies that I've been talking about and thousands more are really trying to get to a place where they can get a device up against your skin so they can read your skin temperature and your pulse and so forth and try to get some sense of your mental state, how much fatigue, how much focus there is in you, and judge you on that basis. And she, I think, has done a really good job of that. The other one I would just point out because it's a big mind changer for me is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. That book will show you just how little of your conscious life is actually under your control and how much of it is being decided by these ancient instincts. And it, for me, was a hugely helpful thing in understanding, my relationship, it changed my relationship to all kinds of things. I quit drinking based on that book, like all that stuff. It just is a huge life changer for me. So that's another one that I would recommend.
Amazing. Both amazing recommendations. And Nita is a former guest on the show. So I
Oh,
could
no way. Fantastic. Yeah.
not agree with you more.
Great choice.
Yeah.
Great choice. Yeah. She's one of my heroes. I think she does a great job of explaining this stuff both in very stark terms, but also in some hopeful terms. She's much more, I'm much more like, well, what can you do? And she's much more, she's a law professor, so she knows what she would do next, which is great.
Right. To your previous point about suing the bejesus out of somebody.
Yeah, exactly. Let's take more lawyers, please.
Yeah. Final question. What is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
Oh, man. Oh, that's a really good one. Well, we've described sort of over the course of this conversation, my journey through hacking your mind and the loop. And for me, prior to hacking your mind, I was the kind of person who really believed that like the right speech and the right light with the right language can sort of change anybody's mind. And then if we all just sort of like had enough education, it would all be fine. And I have an episode in the book that I describe where I went and interviewed this guy, one of many people I've interviewed, who was in the grip of opiate addictions. He was addicted to heroin, living on the street. And I remember he said to me, yeah, I had to cop this morning so that I could be well enough to go to work. And it was a huge transformative moment for me because I suddenly realized, this is not a guy of some sort of like, it's not that he has less in his soul than I do somehow. I think I'd had this kind of college freshman's idea that like some people have an addictive personality and some people don't, or some people are vulnerable and some people aren't. And I had always considered myself to be kind of above those risks. And spending time with people who had an opioid addiction helped me see that like all of us are susceptible, and that there are big, powerful, and in many cases commercial forces at work trying to take advantage of that. And so for me, I really had a big transformative moment in realizing like far less of my life is in my control than I think it is, and far more people are trying to fuck with me than I thought were. And I need to be smarter and better about that. And so, yeah, that 2016 to 2020 period when I was writing that book was that really changed my life.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, well, Jake, this has been far more illuminating than I expected, and I already had extremely high expectations.
Well, this was great. I am exhausted. This was this was an intense conversation. I really appreciate your time and the fact that you give as much room as you do for your guests to think these things through together is a really nice and refreshing thing.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for this.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear that. As the last bit, if you could just tell folks quickly where to find you and maybe give a sentence or two on the Rip Current.
I really appreciate that. So the Rip Current is a podcast and newsletter that I run on Substack and on all the podcast platforms. We look at the big invisible forces at work on us all the time. So I interview experts each week in those forces. I'm most active on TikTok, but you guys, I'm trying to grow my YouTube because TikTok's about to go, who knows what the hell's going to happen to TikTok. And so I'm freaked out about that. But I am by Jacob Ward on basically every platform. And so I'm easy to find in all those places. But if you wanted to sign up for that podcast on YouTube, that would be huge. Substack, fine too, would love that. So that's what I'm up to these days.
Boom. Well, Jake, thank you again. I really appreciate you being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you, Jesse. Really appreciate your time.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.